Hello everyone, welcome to Platonic Love Stories with another story. Let's move on to the video. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting soft stripes of light across the bedroom. I stirred awake, the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting in from the kitchen. Beside me, the bed was empty, but the faint sound of humming told me she was already up. My wife, Anna, was always an early riser. I smiled to myself, stretching lazily before getting out of bed. By the time I made it to the kitchen, Anna was already dressed for work, her dark hair neatly tied back, her makeup flawless. She handed me a cup of coffee without a word, her lips curling into a small smile as she turned back to the stove. I leaned against the counter, watching her flip pancakes with practiced ease. This was our routine, our quiet little dance every morning. It was comforting, predictable, and for the most part, perfect. "Big day today?" I asked, sipping the coffee. It was just the way I liked it, strong, with a splash of cream. "Not really," she replied, her voice light. "Just the usual meetings. You?" "Same, though I might have to stay late to finish that report for Thompson." Anna nodded absently, her attention already shifting to her phone, which buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen, her expression unreadable, before quickly silencing it and slipping it into her purse. I didn't think much of it at the time. Anna was always getting messages, work emails, group chats with her friends, reminders from her fitness app. It was part of her busy, organized life. We ate breakfast together, in comfortable silence, the morning news playing softly in the background. Anna scrolled through her phone between bites, occasionally murmuring something about a work deadline or a friend's upcoming birthday. I half listened, my mind already drifting to the day ahead. Work had been hectic lately, and Thompson, my boss, had been riding me harder than usual, but I tried not to let it bother me. After all, I had a lot to be grateful for: a stable job, a beautiful home, and a wife who somehow managed to keep everything running smoothly. As we finished eating, Anna stood and began clearing the table. "I'll probably be home late tonight," she said casually, her back to me as she loaded the dishwasher. "There's a team dinner after work." "Oh, okay," I replied, trying to hide my disappointment. We hadn't spent much time together lately, and I'd been looking forward to a quiet evening at home. But I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Anna worked hard, and she deserved to have a social life outside of our marriage. "Have fun," I added, forcing a smile. She turned to me, her eyes softening. "Thanks. I'll try not to be too late." She leaned in to kiss me on the cheek, her perfume lingering as she pulled away. "Love you." "Love you too," I said automatically, watching as she grabbed her coat and headed for the door. The sound of her heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoed in the quiet house, followed by the soft click of the door closing behind her. I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty space where she'd been. Something felt off, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way she'd been so distracted all morning, or the way she'd rushed out the door without her usual goodbye hug. Or maybe it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me after too many late nights at the office. Shaking off the feeling, I finished my coffee and got ready for work. The day ahead was busy, and I didn't have time to dwell on vague suspicions. But as I locked the door behind me and stepped out into the crisp morning air, I couldn't shake the nagging sense that something was about to change. The office was its usual hive of activity, the hum of keyboards and murmured conversations filling the air. I settled into my desk, trying to focus on the report Thompson had asked for, but my mind kept wandering back to Anna. She'd been acting strange lately, more distant, more distracted. I told myself it was nothing, just stress from work or maybe fatigue. But the nagging feeling in the back of my mind refused to go away. "Hey, you okay?" My colleague Mark leaned over the partition between our desks, his brow furrowed in concern. "You've been staring at that screen for like 20 minutes without typing a word." I forced a laugh, running a hand through my hair. "Yeah, just tired. Didn't sleep well last night." Mark nodded sympathetically. "I hear you. My kids were up all night, some kind of stomach bug. I'm running on caffeine and sheer willpower at this point." I chuckled, grateful for the distraction. Mark was one of the few people at work I could talk to without feeling like I was being judged. He'd been with the company for years and had a way of cutting through the office politics with his dry sense of humor. "Anyway," he said, straightening up, "Thompson's looking for you. Something about the quarterly numbers. You might want to head over before he starts breathing down your neck." "Great," I muttered, closing my laptop. "Just what I need." Thompson's office was at the far end of the floor, a glass-walled corner suite that overlooked the city skyline. As I approached, I could see him through the glass, pacing back and forth as he talked on the phone. He was in his usual uniform, a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up to the elbows, and a tie that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Even from a distance, he exuded an air of authority, his sharp features and commanding presence making him impossible to ignore. I knocked lightly on the door, and he waved me in without missing a beat in his conversation. "Yes, I understand that, but we need to see a return on investment before we commit to anything further," he was saying, his tone clipped. "I'll have the numbers to you by end of day." "Good. Talk then." He hung up and turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You wanted to see me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "I need an update on the Henderson account. Where are we with the projections?" I launched into my explanation, grateful for the distraction. Thompson listened intently, his sharp eyes never leaving mine. He was a demanding boss, but I respected his work ethic and attention to detail. Still, there was something about him that always put me on edge, a coldness, a calculated distance that made it hard to feel at ease around him. As I wrapped up my update, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Good," he said finally. "But I need those numbers finalized by tomorrow. No excuses." "Understood," I said, standing to leave. "Oh, and one more thing," he added, his tone casual. "Anna mentioned you might be joining us for the team dinner tonight." I froze, my hand on the door handle. "Anna?" "Yes," he said, raising an eyebrow. "She didn't tell you?" "No," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice neutral. "She must have forgotten." Thompson shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Well, it's at 7, the usual place. Feel free to join us if you're free." "I'll see," I said, forcing a smile before stepping out of the office. As I walked back to my desk, my mind raced. Anna hadn't mentioned anything about a team dinner, let alone that Thompson would be there. And why would she be discussing our plans with him? The questions swirled in my head, each one more unsettling than the last. By the time I got back to my desk, I was too distracted to focus on work. I pulled out my phone and texted Anna, "Hey, Thompson mentioned a team dinner tonight. Are you going?" Her reply came a few minutes later. "Yeah, sorry, forgot to tell you. You're welcome to join if you want." I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. It wasn't like Anna to forget something like that, and the fact that Thompson had brought it up first made me feel even more uneasy. "Everything okay?" Mark's voice broke through my thoughts. "Yeah," I said, slipping my phone back into my pocket. "Just family stuff." He gave me a knowing look but didn't press further. "Well, if you need to talk, you know where to find me." I nodded, forcing a smile. But as I turned back to my computer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cracks in my perfect life were starting to show, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face what lay beneath. The team dinner was in full swing by the time I arrived at the restaurant. It was one of those upscale places with dim lighting, sleek decor, and a menu that didn't list prices. I spotted my colleagues gathered around a long table near the back, their laughter and chatter blending with the soft hum of jazz playing in the background. Anna was seated at the far end of the table, her back to me. She was deep in conversation with someone, her gestures animated, her laughter ringing out above the noise. As I approached, I realized she was talking to Thompson. He was leaning in slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips as he listened to her. Something about the way they were sitting, close, almost intimate, made my stomach twist. "Hey, you made it!" Mark's voice broke through my thoughts, and I turned to see him waving me over. I forced a smile and took a seat next to him, trying to ignore the knot of unease in my chest. Yeah, figured I'd stop by, I said, glancing around the table. Everyone seemed to be having a good time, their glasses clinking as they toasted to another successful quarter. But my attention kept drifting back to Anna and Thompson. They were still talking, their heads bent together like they were sharing a secret. You okay? Mark asked, following my gaze. You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, I said quickly, tearing my eyes away. Just tired, I guess. Mark gave me a skeptical look, but didn't press further. Instead, he launched into a story about his kids, and I did my best to listen, nodding and laughing at the right moments. But my mind was elsewhere, my thoughts circling back to Anna and Thompson. As the evening wore on, I found myself watching them more and more. They seemed to be in their own little world, oblivious to everyone else around them. At one point, Anna reached out and touched Thompson's arm, her fingers lingering for just a moment too long. It was a small gesture, the kind of thing that could easily be dismissed as harmless. But to me, it felt like a punch to the gut. By the time the dinner wrapped up, I was desperate to get out of there. I waited by the door as Anna said her goodbyes, her cheeks flushed from the wine, her smile bright. When she finally joined me, she linked her arm through mine and leaned her head against my shoulder. That was fun, she said, her voice slightly slurred. Thanks for coming. Yeah, I said, my tone flat. Fun. She didn't seem to notice my lack of enthusiasm, chattering away as we walked to the car. I barely heard a word she said, my mind racing with questions I was too afraid to ask. Was I imagining things? Was I reading too much into innocent interactions? Or was there something more going on? The drive home was quiet, the silence between us heavy with unspoken tension. Anna dozed off in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window. I glanced at her occasionally, my chest tightening with a mix of love and fear. She looked so peaceful, so beautiful. How could I even entertain the thought that she would betray me? But the doubts refused to go away. Over the next few days, I found myself noticing little things I might have overlooked before. The way Anna's phone was always face down on the counter, the way she'd disappear into another room to take calls, the way she'd been dressing up more for work, her outfits more polished, her makeup more meticulous. At the office, things weren't any better. Thompson seemed to be around more often, his presence looming over me like a shadow. He'd stop by my desk to ask about the Henderson account, his tone casual but his eyes sharp, as if he were testing me. And then there were the looks, the way his gaze would linger on Anna during meetings, the way he'd smile at her in a way he never did with anyone else. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, that I was letting my imagination run wild. But the more I tried to push the thoughts away, the more they consumed me. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way beneath me. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, wondering and worrying. I needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. It was a Thursday evening when everything changed. Anna had texted me earlier to say she'd be working late, something about a last-minute project deadline. I'd nodded along, pretending it didn't bother me, but the truth was, I was tired of the excuses, tired of the late nights, the missed dinners, the growing distance between us. I'd been sitting on the couch for hours, flipping through channels without really watching anything, when I heard the front door open. Anna stepped inside, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She looked exhausted, her hair slightly disheveled, her makeup smudged. But there was something else in her expression, a flicker of guilt, maybe, or unease. It was gone in an instant, replaced by her usual smile. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag by the door. "Sorry I'm so late. Work was crazy." "Yeah," I said, my voice flat. "Crazy." She hesitated, her smile faltering for a moment before she walked over to the couch. "Are you okay? You seem off." "I'm fine," I lied, avoiding her gaze. "Just tired." She studied me for a moment, her brow furrowed, before sighing and sitting down beside me. "I'm sorry I've been so busy lately. It's just been a lot at work, you know." I nodded. But I didn't trust myself to speak. The words were bubbling up inside me, threatening to spill out, but I forced them down. Now wasn't the time. Not when I didn't have proof. Not when I wasn't sure if I was just imagining things. Anna leaned her head against my shoulder, her body relaxing into mine. "I miss you," she said softly. "We should do something this weekend, just the two of us." "What do you think?" "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That sounds nice." We sat there in silence for a while, the tension between us slowly easing. But even as I wrapped my arm around her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the woman I loved, the woman I'd built a life with, was keeping something from me. Later that night, after Anna had fallen asleep, I found myself standing in the hallway outside our bedroom, staring at her phone on the kitchen counter. It was face down, as usual, but this time, it buzzed softly, the screen lighting up with a notification. My heart pounded as I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I swiped to unlock it. The password screen stared back at me, taunting me. I hesitated, my mind racing. I'd never invaded Anna's privacy like this before, but the doubts had been eating away at me for weeks. I needed to know the truth. After a few tries, I managed to guess the password, our anniversary. The screen unlocked, and I was immediately greeted by a string of messages from Thompson. My stomach dropped as I scrolled through them, my heart sinking with each word. "Can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again? You looked so beautiful today." The messages went on and on, each one more damning than the last. My hands shook as I read them, my vision blurring with tears. It was one thing to suspect, to wonder, but seeing the proof in black and white was like a knife to the chest. I stumbled back, the phone slipping from my hands and clattering onto the counter. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet house, but Anna didn't stir. She was still asleep, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I sank to the floor, my back against the cabinets, and buried my face in my hands. The tears came then, hot and uncontrollable, as the weight of what I'd discovered crashed down on me. My wife, the woman I'd loved, trusted, built a life with, was having an affair. And not just with anyone, with my boss. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. It wasn't just the lies or the secrecy. It was the fact that she'd chosen him, Thompson of all people, the man who'd always made me feel small, insignificant, like I was never quite good enough. And now he'd taken the one thing that had always been mine. I don't know how long I sat there crying in the dark, but eventually the tears ran dry. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and took a deep, shuddering breath. I couldn't stay here, not like this. I needed to think, to process, to figure out what to do next. Quietly, I grabbed my keys and slipped out the front door, leaving Anna asleep in our bed. The night air was cool against my skin as I walked to the car, my mind racing. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house, not tonight. As I drove through the empty streets, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. My marriage was over. The life I'd built, the future I'd imagined, it was all gone, and I had no idea what came next. I didn't go back home that night. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the city, the streets empty and quiet, until the sun began to rise. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, sadness, betrayal. But beneath it all was a deep, aching hurt that I couldn't shake. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but I knew I couldn't put this off any longer. Anna was in the kitchen when I walked in, her back to me as she poured herself a cup of coffee. She turned when she heard the door, her expression shifting from surprise to concern as she took in my disheveled appearance. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. "I woke up and you were gone. I tried calling, but you didn't answer." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stood there staring at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one I'd seen in those messages. She looked the same as she always did. Beautiful, put together, the woman I'd fallen in love with, but now I couldn't see her without feeling a sharp pang of betrayal. "We need to talk," I said finally, my voice low and steady despite the storm raging inside me. Anna's brow furrowed, and she set her coffee cup down on the counter. "Okay," she said slowly. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "I know about you and Thompson." For a moment, she just stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, the color drained from her face, and she took a step back, her hand gripping the edge of the counter for support. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Don't," I said, cutting her off. "Don't lie to me, Anna. I saw the messages. I know everything." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked like she might deny it again, but then her shoulders slumped and she looked away, her face filled with shame. I didn't mean for this to happen," she said softly. The admission hit me like a punch to the gut, and I had to steady myself against the wall to keep from collapsing. Hearing her say it out loud, confirming what I already knew, was somehow even worse than discovering the messages. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "A few months," she said finally. "It started after that conference in Chicago. We were working late and, I don't know, it just happened." "Just happened?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Anna, you don't just happen to have an affair with someone. You made a choice. You chose him over me." "I know," she said, tears streaming down her face. "And I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my voice breaking. "You hurt me more than I ever thought possible. How could you do this, Anna? How could you betray me like this?" She didn't answer, just stood there crying, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Part of me wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but the other part, the part that was still reeling from the betrayal, kept me rooted to the spot. "I love you," she said finally, her voice choked with tears. "I never stopped loving you. It was a mistake, a terrible, horrible mistake." "A mistake," I repeated, my voice cold. "Do you have any idea what this has done to me? To us? You've destroyed everything, Anna. Everything we built, everything we had, it's gone." She flinched at my words, but I didn't stop. The anger and pain that had been building inside me for weeks finally spilled over, and I couldn't hold it back anymore. "How could you do this with him of all people?" I demanded. "Thompson? My boss? The man who's always treated me like I'm nothing? Did you even think about how this would make me feel? Or did you just not care?" "Of course I care," she said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know what happened. I got caught up in something I shouldn't have, and I couldn't stop." "But you could have," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You could have stopped it at any time. You could have walked away. But you didn't. You chose him over me." She didn't respond, just stood there crying, her face buried in her hands. I wanted to scream, to yell, to make her understand the depth of the pain she'd caused me. But instead, I just stood there, feeling hollow and broken. "I need some time," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. "I can't do this right now. I can't be here with you." Anna looked up at me, her eyes filled with desperation. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't leave. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know if we can," I said. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this." And with that, I turned and walked out the door, leaving her standing there in the kitchen, alone. The office was quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. It was late, well past the time when most people had gone home, but I wasn't ready to leave yet. I sat at my desk, staring at the computer screen without really seeing it, my mind racing with thoughts of Anna and the mess I'd helped create. I'd always prided myself on being in control, of my career, my relationships, my life. But this was something I hadn't planned for, something I hadn't seen coming. And now, it was spiraling out of control, threatening to destroy everything I'd worked so hard to build. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled me from my thoughts, and I looked up to see him standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, and for a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. This wasn't the confident, capable man I'd hired all those years ago. This was someone broken, someone who'd been pushed to the edge. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and steady despite the obvious pain in his eyes. I nodded, gesturing for him to come in. He closed the door behind him and took a seat across from me, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could feel the weight of his anger, his betrayal, pressing down on me. "I know about you and Anna," he said, cutting straight to the point. "I saw the messages." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, studying him carefully. I'd always respected him, his work ethic, his intelligence, his dedication. But now, looking at him, I felt a pang of guilt. I'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. "I'm sorry," I said finally, my voice quiet but sincere. "I never meant for this to happen." "But it did," he said, his voice rising. "You slept with my wife, Thompson. My wife. How could you do that? How could you betray me like this?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It wasn't about you," I said. "It was never about you. Anna and we got caught up in something we shouldn't have. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's your excuse, that it was a mistake?" "I'm not trying to excuse it," I said, my tone firm. "I'm just telling you the truth. It wasn't planned. It wasn't intentional. It just happened." He shook his head, his expression filled with disbelief. "Do you have any idea what this has done to me? To us? You've destroyed my marriage, Thompson. You've destroyed everything." I flinched at his words, but I didn't argue. He was right. I had destroyed something precious, something irreplaceable, and no amount of apologies could undo that. "I know," I said quietly, "and I'm sorry. Truly, I am. But I can't change what's happened. All I can do is try to make it right." "Make it right?" he repeated, his voice bitter. "How? How do you plan to make this right?" I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know how to fix this, how to repair the damage I'd caused, but I knew I had to try. "I'll step back," I said finally. "I'll give you space. Give Anna space. I'll do whatever it takes to make this easier for you." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Easier for me? Do you really think that's possible? Do you really think anything you do could make this easier?" "No," I admitted, "but I have to try. I owe you that much." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he just sat there, staring at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. Finally, he stood, his hands still clenched into fists. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this," he said, his voice trembling. "But I need you to stay away from Anna, from me, from my life. Do you understand?" I nodded, my chest tightening with regret. "I understand." He turned and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the silence of my office. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair where he'd been, the weight of what I'd done pressing down on me. I'd always thought of myself as a man in control. But now, for the first time in my life, I felt completely and utterly powerless. The days blurred together after the confrontation. I went through the motions, waking up, going to work, coming home. But it all felt hollow, like I was living someone else's life. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and empty, a constant reminder of what I'd lost. Anna had moved out temporarily, staying with a friend while we figured out what to do next. Part of me was relieved to have the space, but another part, a smaller, quieter part. Missed her. Missed the way she'd laugh at my terrible jokes, the way she'd curl up next to me on the couch, the way she'd say my name like it was the most important word in the world. But then I'd remember the messages, the way she'd lied to me, the way she'd chosen him over me, and the anger would come rushing back, hot and suffocating. I'd lash out at inanimate objects, punching walls, throwing dishes, anything to release the rage that burned inside me. Work wasn't any better. Thompson had kept his word, staying out of my way as much as possible, but his presence still loomed over me like a shadow. Every time I saw him, every time I heard his voice, I was reminded of what he'd done, of what he'd taken from me. It was a constant, gnawing pain that I couldn't escape. One evening, after another long, exhausting day, I found myself sitting on the floor of the living room, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a photo album in the other. The pages were filled with memories, vacations, birthdays, anniversaries, all the moments that had once made me so happy. But now they just made me feel empty. I flipped through the pages, my vision blurring with tears as I stared at the pictures of Anna and me. We looked so happy, so in love. How had it come to this? How had we gone from that to this? I didn't have any answers, just more questions, more doubts, more pain. I took a swig of the whiskey, the burn in my throat doing little to dull the ache in my chest. The sound of my phone buzzing on the coffee table pulled me from my thoughts. I glanced at the screen, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Anna's name. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me and I picked it up. "Hello?" I said, my voice hoarse. "Hey," she said softly. I wanted to check in. See how you're doing?" I laughed bitterly, taking another sip of the whiskey. "How do you think I'm doing, Anna?" "My life is falling apart, and it's all because of you." She was silent for a moment, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "I know," she said finally, "and I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," I said, my voice breaking. "You hurt me more than I ever thought possible, and I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that." "I understand," she said, her voice trembling. I needed you to know that I'm sorry, that I regret what I did, and that I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I sat there, staring at the photo album in my lap, the images of our happier days staring back at me. Part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that we could fix this, that we could find our way back to each other. But another part, a bigger part, wasn't sure if I could ever trust her again. "I don't know if we can fix this," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." She was silent for a long time, and I could hear the tears in her voice when she finally spoke. "I understand," she said softly, "but I'm not giving up on us. Not yet." I didn't respond. Instead, I just sat there, listening to the sound of her breathing on the other end of the line until she finally hung up. The silence that followed was deafening, and I felt more alone than ever. I took another swig of the whiskey, the burn in my throat doing little to dull the ache in my chest. The storm inside me raged on, a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and regret that I couldn't escape. And as I sat there, staring at the empty bottle in my hand, I realized that I didn't know how much longer I could keep going like this. The idea came to me in the middle of the night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I couldn't stay here, not in this house, not in this city, not with the memories of Anna and Thompson haunting me at every turn. I needed to get away, even if just for a little while. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I called Mark and told him I needed a few days off, citing personal reasons. He didn't ask questions, just told me to take the time I needed. I packed a bag with the essentials, clothes, toiletries, a few books, and left a note for Anna on the kitchen counter, letting her know I'd be gone for a while. I didn't have a destination in mind when I got in the car. I just drove, letting the open road guide me. The further I got from the city, the lighter I felt, as if I were leaving some of the pain behind with every mile. By the time I reached the mountains, the air was crisp and clean. the scenery a stark contrast to the chaos I'd left behind. I found a small cabin tucked away in the woods, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The owner, an elderly man with a kind smile, handed me the keys and told me to make myself at home. I thanked him and stepped inside, the quiet and solitude wrapping around me like a blanket. For the first few days, I did nothing. I slept in late, cooked simple meals, and spent hours sitting on the porch, watching the trees sway in the breeze. It was peaceful, but the thoughts I'd been trying to escape followed me here, creeping in during the quiet moments. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself flipping through the books I'd brought with me. One of them was a journal Anna had given me years ago, its pages still blank. I'd never been much of a writer, but something about the quiet of the cabin made me pick up a pen and start writing. At first, it was just random thoughts, fragments of memories, snippets of conversations, the emotions I'd been trying to suppress. But as I kept writing, the words began to flow more freely, and I found myself pouring out everything I'd been holding inside. I wrote about Anna, about the way she'd made me feel when we first met, the way her laughter had lit up a room, the way she'd been my anchor during the hardest times. I wrote about the affair, the betrayal, the anger and hurt that still burned inside me. And I wrote about Thompson, about the way he'd always made me feel small, insignificant, like I was never quite good enough. By the time I finished, my hand was cramping, and the journal was filled with pages of messy, emotional scrawl. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity. The storm inside me hadn't completely subsided, but it felt more manageable, like I could finally see a way forward. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter, as if the act of writing had released some of the weight I'd been carrying. I decided to go for a hike, something I hadn't done in years. The trail was steep and challenging, but the physical exertion felt good, grounding me in the present. As I reached the top of the ridge, the view took my breath away. The mountains stretched out before me, their peaks bathed in golden sunlight. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sense of peace. The world was so much bigger than my problems, my pain. And maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to move forward. I sat there for a long time, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, the warmth on my face a reminder that life went on. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still so many questions, so many decisions to make. But for the first time, I felt like I had the strength to face them. When I finally returned to the cabin, I felt different, lighter, clearer, more focused. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep running from my problems. It was time to go back and face them head on. The drive back home felt different. The weight that had pressed down on me for weeks was still there, but it no longer felt suffocating. The time away had given me clarity, and though I didn't have all the answers, I knew what I needed to do. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had. Quiet, familiar, yet somehow foreign. Anna's car was parked outside, and I felt a pang of anxiety as I turned off the engine. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face her, but I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I stepped inside, the sound of the door closing behind me echoing through the empty hallway. Anna was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book in her hands. She looked up when she heard me, her expression a mix of surprise and apprehension. "You're back," she said, her voice soft. "Yeah," I replied, setting my bag down by the door. "We need to talk." She nodded, setting the book aside and folding her hands in her lap. I could see the tension in her posture, the way her eyes searched mine for some hint of what was coming. I took a deep breath and sat down across from her, the distance between us feeling both necessary and painful. "I've had a lot of time to think," I began, my voice steady. "About us, about what happened, about what I want." Anna didn't say anything, just sat there, waiting for me to continue. Her silence gave me the space I needed to gather my thoughts. "I'm not going to pretend that what you did didn't hurt me," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "It did, more than I can put into words. but I also know that I can't keep living in this limbo, wondering if we can fix this, or if it's even worth trying. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I understand, she said softly, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with. The woman who'd been my partner, my confidant, my best friend. But I also saw the woman who'd betrayed me, who'd shattered my trust in the worst possible way. I don't know if we can fix this, I said honestly. I don't know if I can ever fully trust you again. But I do know that I don't want to give up on us without trying. Her eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment she looked like she might argue. But then she nodded, her tears spilling over. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for giving us a chance. It's not going to be easy, I warned her. We're going to have to work at this, really work at it. And it's going to take time. I know, she said, her voice firm, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I love you, and I don't want to lose you. Her words hit me like a punch to the chest, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The love in her voice was genuine, and it reminded me of all the reasons I'd fallen for her in the first place. But it also reminded me of how much we'd lost, and how much we'd have to rebuild. We'll take it one day at a time, I said finally. But there are going to be rules, boundaries, and if you cross them, if you lie to me again, that's it. There won't be any second chances. She nodded, her expression serious. I understand, and I'll respect whatever boundaries you need. We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling over us. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything that had happened, the pain, the anger, the betrayal. But I also thought about the love, the memories, the life we'd built together. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew that if we could get through this, we could get through anything. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally moving forward. The days that followed were a strange mix of tension and tentative hope. Anna and I moved carefully around each other, like two people learning to dance for the first time. We'd agreed to take things one day at a time, but the weight of what had happened still hung between us, a constant reminder of how fragile our relationship had become. We started with small steps. Anna moved back into the house, but we slept in separate rooms. It wasn't ideal, but it felt necessary, a way to ease back into sharing the same space without overwhelming each other. We also began attending couples counseling, something I'd been hesitant about at first, but had come to see as a necessary part of the healing process. The first session was awkward, to say the least. Sitting in that small, brightly lit room with a stranger felt surreal, like we were actors in a play we hadn't rehearsed. But as the therapist guided us through the conversation, asking questions and encouraging us to be honest, I began to see the value in it. How are you feeling about where you are right now? The therapist asked, looking at me. I hesitated, unsure of how to put my feelings into words. I'm conflicted, I said finally. I want to believe that we can fix this, but I'm also scared that I'll never be able to trust her again. Anna flinched at my words, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. I know I've hurt you, she said softly, and I know it's going to take time to rebuild that trust, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. The therapist nodded, jotting something down in her notebook. Trust is one of the most difficult things to rebuild after a betrayal, she said. But it's not impossible. It will take time, patience, and a lot of hard work. But if you're both committed to the process, it can be done. Her words gave me a glimmer of hope, but they also reminded me of how much work lay ahead. Rebuilding trust wasn't something that could happen overnight. It would require honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront the pain head-on. Outside of therapy, we began to establish new routines. We started having dinner together every night, something we hadn't done in months. At first, The conversations were stilted and awkward, but over time, they began to flow more naturally. We talked about work, about books, about the little things that had once been the foundation of our relationship. But there were also moments of tension, moments when the pain and anger would bubble to the surface. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Anna mentioned Thompson in passing, and I felt a surge of anger that took me by surprise. "Why would you bring him up?" I snapped, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Anna looked startled, her eyes wide with guilt. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to—" "I don't want to hear his name," I interrupted, my hands clenched into fists. "Not now, not ever." She nodded, her expression filled with regret. "I understand," she said softly. "I won't mention him again." The moment passed, but it left a lingering tension between us, a reminder of how fragile our progress was. It was in those moments that I questioned whether we could really fix this, whether the pain of the betrayal would ever fully go away. But then there were other moments, moments of connection, of hope. Like the time we stayed up late talking, laughing about an old inside joke that had once been a staple of our relationship. Or the time she surprised me with breakfast in bed, a small gesture that reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with. It was in those moments that I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Months had passed since the affair came to light, and life had settled into a new rhythm, one that was far from perfect, but felt more stable than the chaos that had defined the early days. Anna and I were still navigating the delicate balance of rebuilding our relationship, but the sharp edges of pain and anger had begun to dull, replaced by a cautious optimism. We continued attending couples counseling, and though the sessions were often difficult, they had become a safe space for us to confront our feelings and work through the lingering issues. The therapist had encouraged us to focus on communication, and we'd made a conscious effort to be more open with each other, even when it was uncomfortable. One evening, as we sat on the couch after dinner, Anna turned to me, her expression serious. "Can we talk?" she asked. I nodded, setting aside the book I'd been reading. "Of course. What's on your mind?" She hesitated, twisting her hands in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she said slowly. "About the choices I made and the pain I caused you. And I need you to know how sorry I am. Not just for the affair, but for everything. For lying to you, for betraying your trust, for making you feel like you weren't enough." Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. I'd heard her apologize before, but this felt different, more raw, more honest. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice quiet. "That means a lot." She nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I know I can't change what happened," she said, "but I want you to know that I'm committed to making things right, to being the person you deserve." I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I know you are," I said, "and I'm committed to this too, but it's going to take time. There are still moments when I feel angry, when I wonder if I'll ever be able to fully trust you again." "I understand," she said softly, "and I'll do whatever it takes to earn that trust back, no matter how long it takes." We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling over us. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was progress, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. Work had also changed in the months since the affair. Thompson had kept his distance, as promised, and I'd taken steps to establish clearer boundaries with him. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of tension, moments when I felt the old anger bubbling to the surface, but I was learning to navigate those feelings without letting them consume me. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I ran into Thompson in the parking lot. He looked surprised to see me, but he didn't try to avoid me, as he had in the past. "Hey," he said, his tone cautious. "How are you?" I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind him of the pain he'd caused, but another part, a calmer, more rational part, knew that holding on to that anger would only hurt me in the long run. "I'm okay," I said finally, taking things one day at a time. He nodded, his expression filled with regret. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for everything. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I regret it, deeply." I studied him for a moment, searching for any hint of insincerity, but all I saw was genuine remorse, and for the first time I felt a flicker of empathy for him. He'd made a terrible mistake, one that had cost him my respect and trust, but he was still human, still capable of regret. "Thank you," I said finally. "That means a lot." He nodded, looking relieved. "If there's ever anything I can do to make things right, just let me know." "I will," I said, though I knew there was nothing he could do to truly make things right. Some wounds ran too deep to be healed by words alone. As I drove home that evening, I thought about how far I'd come since the affair had first come to light. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined me. I'd learned to live with it, to carry it without letting it weigh me down. And in doing so, I'd found a new sense of strength, a new sense of self. When I got home, Anna was in the kitchen, cooking dinner. She looked up when I walked in, her face lighting up with a smile. "Hey," she said. "How was your day?" "It was good," I said, setting my bag down. "How about yours?" "Good," she replied, turning back to the stove. "I tried a new recipe. Hope you're hungry." I smiled, feeling a sense of warmth that I hadn't felt in a long time. Life wasn't perfect, and our relationship was still a work in progress, but for the first time in months, I felt like we were on the right path, and that was enough. A year had passed since the affair had shattered my world, and though the scars remained, they no longer felt as raw. Life had settled into a new rhythm, one that was different from what I'd once imagined, but still filled with moments of joy and connection. Anna and I had worked hard to rebuild our relationship, and while it wasn't the same as before, it was stronger in some ways, more honest, more intentional. We'd celebrated our anniversary a few weeks earlier, a quiet dinner at home instead of the extravagant trips we'd taken in the past. It had felt fitting, a reminder that the foundation of our relationship wasn't grand gestures, but the small, everyday moments of love and commitment. As I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The pain, the anger, the betrayal. It had all been so overwhelming at the time, so all-consuming. But now, looking back, I could see how far I'd come, how much I'd grown. Anna stepped outside, joining me on the porch with 2 cups of tea. She handed me one and sat down beside me, her presence a comforting reminder of the life we'd built together. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice soft. "Everything," I said, taking a sip of the tea. "How far we've come, how much has changed." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's been a hard year," she said. "But I'm grateful for where we are now, for the chance to rebuild what we had." "Me too," I said, reaching out to take her hand. "It hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it." We sat there in silence for a while, watching as the sky turned from orange to deep purple. The air was cool, the kind of evening that felt peaceful and full of possibility. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't worked through this?" Anna asked after a while. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. What matters is where we are now, not what could have been." She smiled, squeezing my hand. "I'm glad we're here." "Me too," I said, feeling a sense of contentment that I hadn't felt in a long time. The future was still uncertain, as it always is. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, times when the old wounds would ache. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever came our way. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, I thought about the journey we'd been on, the pain, the healing, the growth. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as I sat there, holding Anna's hand and looking up at the stars, I felt a sense of hope. For us, for our future, for the life we were building together. The past was behind us, and the future was ours to shape. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Don't forget to click the notification bell icon to stay notified